us, welcome to part 1 of our webinar series, Intro to Curriculum Mapping with Janet Hale. We're going to start today off with a quick poll. We'd love to hear from you on where you currently rate your curriculum mapping initiative level. So in this, we're ranking from exploration to advanced. Exploration being you're just starting to look into curriculum mapping. Beginner, you've just started the process of curriculum mapping. Intermediate, you've gone through the process for a little while now, and then advanced, you've been doing this for a few years. So I'm just going to send this poll out. You should be seeing it on your screens now. I see some of you have already been answering the chat too. Just give a moment or two for everyone to answer. Looks like right now we have mostly beginners, but intermediate level right on their tails. So good variety of people here. And, you know, this is the intro to curriculum mapping. However, you know, there's going to be tips and tricks shared by Janet throughout these sessions that are going to be relevant and helpful for any stage of curriculum mapping. Okay. And this poll, I'll just share the results so everyone can see as well. So we ended up at 20% with exploration, 39% with beginner, 35% with intermediate, and 5% with advanced. So whatever level you're currently at, you know, welcome. We're so happy to have you here today. And before we get started into our core content today, I do want to introduce our incredible speaker for this series. So please give a warm welcome to Janet Hale. Janet is the founder and president of Curriculum Decisions. She specializes in curriculum mapping, curriculum design, and standards literacy and alignment. For the past 30 years, she has worked with curriculum instruction and assessment leadership, as well as teaching in elementary, secondary, and special education classrooms. She has written several books published by ASCD and Corn Press, with 2 focusing on curriculum mapping, as you can see with these lovely book covers below here. This series today is brought to you by Chalk. Chalk is a planning and analytics platform that enables K-12 schools and districts to develop a cohesive and standards-aligned map for curriculum and instruction. Chalk supports millions of educators and thousands of schools throughout the world. To learn more about Chalk or to get support on your curriculum initiatives, please visit chalk.com/demo. Now, without further ado, I'll hand things off to Janet to get things started. Thank you, Janet.
All right. And you should be good, Jen, if you want to go ahead and try that on your end.
All righty. I'll click and see what happens. There we go. Well, welcome everybody to, just as you heard, Sarah. And thank you, Sarah and Keenan, for joining me today and all the behind the scenes work that you've been doing. I am excited to have you have done that poll because it gives me a good idea who's here. I also like to kind of bring in the whole idea of what I call the 3 A's. Some of you are really A to anchor. You really are truly just getting started and you really want to anchor. Some have gone a little bit farther, more in that beginning or intermediate, and you really are looking for kind of some adjustments. Like we think we're doing it all right, but we don't really know. So it's nice to get some adjustments going on. And then I have some of those people that are advanced. And so I sort of say, it's good to get affirmed. It's kind of nice to be affirmed, like, yes, we're doing it correctly. Or also though, there'll be probably a mixture of all 3 with what I share. So I'm really excited. Part 1, which is today, is really focused on really getting started. And I like to think of it as building capacity. This definition just comes off the free dictionary on the internet. I did sort of add an emphasis to a word because I think it's really important when we start mapping. And that is that we want to build capacity. We hear that a lot in education. What I'm really concerned about is that we really want to make sure that we are accurately communicating decisions made. Because one thing I have discovered in working with curriculum mapping now for over 20 years specifically, even the word curriculum mapping means different things to different people. And so what I want to make sure is that for you and your educational system, whatever that is, whether it's a school, a district, a diocese, a charter, what doesn't matter, You have to figure out, to really build that capacity, you have to build a communication that really everybody is understanding what the terms we're using mean, what the expectations are. And so to me, that's a really big piece. And if you want to save a really big roadblock, that's one of them. So what I'd like to do for our time together today is sort of think of it as a mountaintop experience. That's going to be my theme. So we're kind of overlooking kind of where we want to go with curriculum mapping. And so we're just going to sort of have that mountain experience. And then when we meet for part 2, we're going to continue on, but sort of like you can see in this picture, there's someone with their binoculars, and we're going to kind of take now like even still from a sort of a greater, larger perspective, we're going to really hone in with our binoculars on what does it mean to have a quality map and have elements on a map that really allow us to have systemic conversation and decision making. So we're going to also be looking at the idea of, I do a lot of work right now, especially with lost learning and things going on, with prioritizing standards. And so I'm going to show you also in part 2, how can you use the 7-step review process to help with the collaborative decision making. And then kind of like at the end of today, the end of part 2, I'll talk a little bit about just some things to think about for implementation. So this week, it's very much kind of the mountaintop experience, where next time it'll be a little bit more focused, coming down the mountain a little bit toward what you want to do or what you have been doing, but really focusing on it through sort of that lens of binoculars and really looking at some things closely. So today, what should we do before we get started? Or for some of you, what should we try to check on or check into now that we have started? So today we're going to be looking at 4 focuses. And the first one is probably, to me, again, an important piece in building capacity. And that is whenever I work with a learning organization, I really take time to say, we need to figure out what our mental models are of curriculum so that we all are on the same page of understanding. So I call them nuances because, again, in education, we have a tendency to use words in lots of synonym ways. And so then sometimes we get confused. So let's go ahead and start with that one. And we're going to do that, first, with taking just a step back before we take that first step down the mountain. And I want to kind of give 2 thoughts. One is one that Heidi Hayes Jacobs, so many of you I'm sure know, is very well known and recognized in the curriculum mapping world, and a good friend and colleague of mine, is she always says, when you start your curriculum mapping journey and always on it, we have to do things with our students' best interests in mind. So no matter which direction you decide to go in, we have to do it with our students in mind. A lot of times our students aren't present in the room while we're making those decisions, but it's sort of like I see in the picture here, that child or that young adult is always with us, and what we are making decision-wise truly, truly impacts them. And so we want to always keep them in mind. And the second thing, and this really is a big one for me for helping you also with a roadblock, is mapping is a verb. It is not a noun. What I like to say is your maps, which is your noun, is a sort of a byproduct of all your inging. And if you really start off with really a lot of quality inging, really building that capacity, it makes it easier when you actually start developing the maps. Now, I just want to pretend for a moment that we're starting to walk down a little bit our mountain, and all of a sudden we look over and we see this tortoise, which just so happens to be one of my tortoises that my husband took a picture of. But I love his little face. I feel like he almost has a little smirk, because what he's telling you is really an important thing. And that is that Aesop's fable, The Tortoise and the Hare, the moral is important. Slow and steady wins the race. So if you are here representing your administrative group, some teachers who are being called to be a part of the mapping process, I can tell you right now, if anybody above you or someone is telling you, yes, we want to do curriculum mapping, we want to get those maps all done within a year, you're probably not going to have an initiative that actually is sustainable, because there's so many things you need to do to lay a foundation, and then you build. And all the teachers, especially in elementary, they can't focus on all the different disciplines at one time. And so we have to be very strategic in our planning. What are we going to start with? Why are we starting with that? And so on. So it's important to remember that mapping is a verb. And so I work with a lot of schools and districts right now where we're not even at a map point of view right now, but we are very much engaged in making some decisions based on standards. What do we really want students to know and be able to do? prior to actually worrying about quote unquote the noun. So really important is to me the exciting part is teachers and the educators really coming together and having some collegial dialogue and debate about what it is we want our students to know and be able to do. So with that said, I've said enough for a few moments. I'd like you to take a moment here to, how do you, remember mental model, how do you define curriculum? And the way I always like to kind of preface this is pretend you're talking to a parent who's an important stakeholder, but not someone who's necessarily in education. How would you define curriculum for that parent? So as you know, if a parent's asking you that, you've got a nanosecond. We're going to give you a few more moments to kind of talk to yourself. And then in the chat, if you would, go ahead and just pop in, how would you define curriculum? And then we'll give Sarah a chance to kind of read some out to us after you get a few populated in there. So I see some coming in, so keep them coming.
Yes, Amy was quick to type her answer. She says, organizing the stuff we use to teach your kids.
Okay.
There's another one from Afra. Curriculum topics students will be covering. What is being taught, what we want students to know and be able to do. Oh, here's one I like. Curriculum equals instruction plus assessment plus resources, sort of breaking it into a formula. Curriculum is the means of getting students to what needs to be mastered. A scope and sequence of what you want students to know and do. Skills, concepts, content, outcomes from a course. One person simply says backbone.
I did see that one.
Yeah.
Okay, so Sarah, maybe read like 2 or 3 more, and then thank you so much for putting your thoughts in there, and I'm going to continue on. But let me hear a few more, Sarah. What you're picking.
Sure. Oh, you're gonna like this one. Maybe I shouldn't say this.
Uh-oh.
Curriculum is a 3-legged stool, intended, enacted, assessed. Any one leg missing, and it is incomplete.
So they might have had some work with me before, I wonder.
Here's one last one. A clear roadmap for effective leadership and providing support to students.
Great, good. Well, thanks
great answers
for sharing. I really appreciate that. So I just want to kind of share with you a little bit of an experience I had many years ago. So when Heidi Hayes Jacobs actually came out with her sort of landmark book, if you will, called Mapping the Big Picture back in the 1990s, I was so intrigued by what she had to say that I really wanted to hear her in person. So at that time, she was doing something called Curriculum Mapping Academies, and I went to one. And she also said, you know, what is curriculum? And her answer to me was very intriguing. And so I went ahead and thought, I'm going to even expand on that a little bit in my thinking. So what she said is that if you go back to the Latin root of curriculum, it's this idea of an action or a course run in small steps. Well, I did a little bit more research on that just for my own learning. And what I found very interesting was that it really had to do with chariot races. And so when I actually, on my bucket list things was to actually go to Rome, one of the things I really wanted to see was a Circus Maximus. And actually that's what you're seeing at the top here in sort of a fisheye view. And what you're looking at is kind of a well-run curriculum. Because if you look at the bottom picture, and if you know Ben-Hur, either the old movie or the new movie or the book, the track itself that the horses and chariots are running on, that dirt track, that is the curriculum. So if we think about it from that point of view, that curriculum is this path run in small steps. We have to then think about all that goes with making those chariots race around those tracks. So as you kind of said, you know, thought I would like hearing it, Sarah, what I started really using for myself a number of years ago is this idea of a 3-legged stool. And there are a few people like me do use this as an analogy, but I find it really helps me because again, people come with different understandings of curriculum, and we're going to get into a little deeper even the idea of teaching versus learning, which we also saw that in our definitions as well. So you'll notice it says curriculum to me is that big broad word that we all use, but there's curriculum design, there's instruction, and there's assessment. So before I go any farther, I do want to say that we want this stool on an even keel, if you will. And to me, the foundation for all of us in some form or another is going to be standards. So you could be living in a state or a school environment, local agency, where you're using state standards, Common Core standards, could be international standards. It could be standards you've made up. I've had lots of schools I work with make up their own standards. The point is that you have some foundation that you're figuring out how you're developing that curriculum, or possibly even purchasing curriculum in a program sense. So the idea of design, though, like we even know of a very popular one is understanding by design. The idea of the design is, what is it that you really do want your students to know and be able to do, with the idea of the standards playing a role. Then you have the idea of instruction. So how is that going to come alive? Whatever it is that we want our students to be able to do. And I personally like assessment in the middle. And the reason I like that is, to me, it's kind of a combination of both, because there's lots of ways we can start thinking about assessment and evaluation. But really, all three of these play a very specific role in a curriculum. And so with that in mind, and thank you to whoever shout out Lolaire for the three-legged stool, I want to go one step deeper with this, though. And how does the three-legged stool idea of curriculum, how does that mesh with teaching and learning? And I very purposely like to use the image that you see on the screen on the right-hand side, because it's so nuanced. And until teachers and administrators have really had some conversation and build capacity for how they really define these, it makes a huge difference when you start mapping and when you start developing maps. So again, to help you with hopefully not having a roadblock, really working on these two and defining them from a teaching and learning point of view really seems to help a lot. And so with that said, I'm gonna just share just a little story that is a true experience for me, and it's a great analogy for this idea of teaching and learning. So I'm sure some of you don't have to put it in the chat, but you can probably raise your hand to say you've been involved in some kind of addition to a home, or you've built a home, or you've built a school, but you've been involved with an architect and a contractor. And I have had that experience. What happened was my husband and I decided we were going to do an addition to our home, and saved up money for quite a few years, because I really wanted to be able to pay cash for it and not go into debt for it. And so finally we thought we had enough money. And so we went to an architect, very nice gentleman, who I think I was driving him crazy very, very shortly on, but he kept saying, no, you can't do that. No, you can't do that. Nope, can't do that. And I kept saying, why can't we do that? And his answer was the codes. So if you think about my analogy, the architect saying you can't do this because of the codes, or you can do this because of the codes. For us in education as architects, our codes are our standards, right? So we have to follow some type of a guideline. So we stayed for a little bit longer, and finally, and this is really a true story, he said, please go away. I think it was because of me. I was driving him crazy. He didn't really say it quite that way. He said, if you would please come back in a week and I will have your blueprints ready. And remember, all I'm really in the back of my mind wanting now to know is like, how much is going to cost? Have I saved enough money? So we came back a week later. If any of you have dealt with this before, you know that the plans are actually multi-layered. They go through, and each kind of layer is a certain focus. So we got down to the second to last one, and it happened to be the electrical wiring for this addition. And I noticed there were dollar signs all over the paper. At least they appeared that way to me. So I said to him, because I was a little bit nervous and I kind of like to joke around when I am, I said, oh, looks like the electrical is going to be so expensive with all these dollar signs. And he literally rolled his eyes and said, nope, those are light switches. Now, the reason I bring that up is, remember, the architect has designed this blueprint. The reason he knows those are light switches is because also the contractor who needs to read those blueprints knows those are light switches. In other words, the designers of curriculum have to also be ready to share those out to the builders, if you will. So long story short, didn't have enough money. So we raised some more money. A year later, we took our blueprints and we actually interviewed 4 different contractors. That was interesting. All of them are looking at the exact same blueprints. They all had different ways they wanted to make it happen to where we got what we wanted, this particular edition. So we finally went with one, and if you have done any building, it always takes longer than you plan. But the point of the story is, the way I like to think about it to help you with this analogy of teach versus learn, and this idea of the three-legged stool, is architects design. They are the ones that are trying to figure out what is it we want our students to know, be able to do conceptually, and all of those pieces put together, where the contractor now takes that and teaches well. And in today's world, we're finding more personalized learning for students. How do they want to learn it, right? So they can choose how they themselves want to be taught. So the point here, though, is if I go a little bit deeper, we've been talking about the idea of what do we want our students to know and be able to do. I hear that a lot when people define curriculum. I'm going to go take that a little bit deeper. So learning on it, when I'm thinking about I am asked to be an architect, it's what do you want the students to learn and why? That is going to be coming or being influenced by those standards or competencies or your goals and expectations for your students. But now let's talk about two more that we don't quite often talk about on the design level right up front. And that's the when and the where. So we have to go back to our analogy of the root meaning of curriculum. So I'm going to just sort of pretend my hand is a track, if you will. And so if you imagine the chariots going around the track, one lap around the track is one academic year. So the curriculum for 1 year. So when in that academic year is something going to be learned. So quite often, if I said to you right now, hey, what are your third graders learning in math? Oh, they're learning X, no pun intended. But anyway, that's when in the academic year. Where is now vertical. Where in their experience over the years will this be learned? Sometimes our standards already negate that by saying this is expected of a third grader. But for example, if you're using the English language arts standards in high school, there's 9, 10, 11, 12. We can have big discussions about the where. It doesn't have to be 9th grade or 10th grade. It could be both, one or the other. Who is the course? The idea of the course itself. And so all of the W's is discussion that has to take place on an architect mindset. Now, how that's going to all come alive, that's our W, our H, right? It's not a W. How is that all going to come alive? Now, what I find, and I've been doing this work for a long time, is teachers have gone to college for the H. They have not gone to college for the W's. So when teachers are asked to write these maps, a very large portion of those maps is the learning. And so what ends up happening, and they don't mean to, they kind of write lesson plans as a map, not an actual lesson plan. And so we have to make sure that these nuances, that we're all very clear when we're working on a W and when we're working on an H. So to kind of have you now, I've said a lot, apply it. Let's look at this from just back to the stool. So if you now talk to yourself, have a great conversation, or if you're with somebody, turn to your partner, or you can put in a chat, what H's, I should say, what H and what W's do you feel go with each one of these legs? So just take a moment, reflect, and then I'll share with you from my work what I find truly happens. So which of the W's and H, where do they go with our three-legged stool? Okay, I'll go ahead and share, and I'm gonna do it one more time a different way. So if you weren't exactly sure what I was asking, you'll get it the second time. So if I think about curriculum design, this idea of that leg, I really think about pretty much the majority of the W's, right? The what, the why, the when, the where, and the, so like they're all there unless we already know who the who's are gonna be. Now, when it comes to instruction, again, we already can kind of pretty much guess that that's gonna be the how, because that's the instruction. To me, the interesting dialogue and conversation, quite often I find when I work with teachers and administrators, is the assessment. I find it really is a combination of both. Because you have to measure that which you're expecting them to learn. So that is going to be a what and a why. But how it gets measured can be how you want it to be, right? In other words, I can be doing one assessment in my room very differently than a teacher in another room and how she or he is doing the assessment. But what we're expecting of the students, why, are going to be the same. So it can look very different, all right? So it helps if we start kind of, even when we're thinking about defining these curriculum nuances, we have to make sure that within our own world, our own system of our school or district, that we have the same dialogue. Now, one more application time for you. I bet there's a few of you out there that use professional learning community model, right? So you've got 4 questions. Remember, it always goes back to these 4 questions. So which of these 4 questions are dealing with a W, an H, or both? Take a moment. If you're not familiar with the questions, just kind of read them and soak them in for a second. And how would you label these with the three-legged stool in connection with a model that you may use for a framework? All right, so here's my take, and I've worked with a lot of schools and districts that have used these, and they have agreed, we've all agreed that these are pretty much what they think they are too. And that is that the what do we want all students to learn, it's a what and a why. Because all students means all students. And so we have to really look at that from a very interest perspective. And whenever you start mapping, please make sure that you have teachers and administrators from all of your areas of education. So special education needs to be a part of the conversation when you're working on your maps and your mapping, because they're going to have to be also a part of this all students piece. So for me, it's the what and the why. How will we know when they have learned it? Well, to me, that's going to be the what and the how. So how are we going to know that? There's lots of different ways we can start looking at assessments to figure that out, both formally, informally, and so on. What will we do when they have not learned it? Well, if we know what it is based on number 1, I see that in people I work with as the how. How are we going to create intervention? How are we going to help that student get to the point of what needs to be learned by all students? And the last one, really, I have a lot of fun and dialogue with, because there is a lot of kind of disagreement and banter. But again, whatever is decided, it needs to be decided by your district or your school. And what usually does kind of end up happening, it's a combination of what and how, depending on how you actually are building your curriculum. So my point here is you really, to these defining these curriculum nuances, you really want to take time to think about not only mapping, but what frameworks, what models, what are you already doing in your district? Because curriculum mapping is not replacing anything. It's just a new way of doing the business of education when it comes to teaching and learning. So we have been on our mountaintop, and you might be familiar with something called a benchmark trail. A benchmark trail is a trail that goes like this, if you will, in the mountain range, to where at the tops there's a bench. And the idea is that you stop and you sit on the bench to contemplate your experience. So we're going to use the visible thinking routine to see kind of where you are in your thinking. I thought I knew, now I know, now I wonder. You might focus on one of these, 2 of these, or all 3. But what I'd like you to do, as you're sitting on your bench on the benchmark trail, is go ahead and just pop into your chat, your thoughts up to this point in time. And then we'll see, Sarah, if there's anything that we need to also possibly focus on from a question that popped in.
Absolutely.
See, Christina asked for the idea of the professional learning communities, could number 4 also be aware? What if they already know it? I think I agree what you're saying, because now you're thinking about course design. This idea of if they already know it, do we put it into like whatever that it is you want them to learn, just a new course? Does it also go deeper? Like you might be a depth of knowledge, web's environment, and we're going to create within the same course, maybe some level 4 experiences for the students. So they're still applying what it is we're expecting them to learn, but on a deeper level. So there is not a right or wrong answer, as much as that's what I want you to do, is I want you inging. I want you thinking about what's right for us.
Mm-hmm. We're getting a couple of responses here. This one I love. Now I know it is not only okay, but preferable to go slow and steady. That is a great lesson learned so far from this. Another one here, it says, now I know the curriculum nuances and can better explain it to other educational stakeholders involved in the process.
Excellent.
Insight. And, just for people who are taking the time and thinking through this, there's no wrong answers. That's the nice thing about this, right? Now I know it should be expected to learn all of the different goals, but one set at a time. Phew. We'll just share one more quickly. I thought I knew that curriculum mapping was merely ensuring what it is written is taught and tested, but it is so much more. So great lessons learned here so far.
Thanks so much for everybody sharing your ideas. And that's really what this part one is all about. It's just getting on that mountaintop and really thinking about the big picture of what's going on and what do we want to focus on as we start our planning, or if we've already begun, what do we want to tweak or consider for our next step? So I really appreciate that. So now that we've focused on curriculum nuances, let's focus on this idea of differentiating between personal mapping and collaborative mapping, because it goes again to having defined terminology, because that's going to help a lot as you move forward. So went forward there. Keenan, can you kind of flip back for me, please?
Sure.
There you go, to that one.
There we go.
One more,
good.
please. Oh, good. Okay. So personal mapping. When I wrote my book, Sarah, you mentioned my book, the whole idea of guide to curriculum mapping, which, believe it or not, it's been over a decade ago. Things have nuanced and changed over time, even with that, but some of the things have stayed the same. And one of them is this idea of personal mapping. When I wrote the book, it was very popular to call it projected diary mapping, because this idea that a teacher would write their personal take. This is what the plan is for my year, and then kind of change it as the year went by, what really happened. But what's happened in this idea of like sort of iterations is now people just call them individual maps, meaning it's an individual teacher. So I want to just share with you, again, a little bit of a roadblock is back then, kind of like early like 2000s, I would say, it was very popular to start with personal mapping and then coming to agreement on collegial like maps, collaborative. Here's the problem though, is that teachers were writing their personal maps kind of on an instructional level. And so it was very hard to glean out of that what was the learning. And so I'm going to kind of talk about a suggestion as we go through, but let's first talk about definitions. When I think about a personal map and I think about a system, I think of like a grove of trees as a system. And that's really to me what an educational system is. I think of oak grove, because an oak grove has mighty roots. Like your teachers care, they're passionate about the students that are in their care. But the root systems do not, they might tickle each other, but they do not interconnect. So what happens in a, here we go. What happens in a personal mapping situation is it does provide personal perspectives, but it is very sort of isolated. It's one teacher or one educator's perspective on here's what is being learned and why I'm having them learn it. And then the how is really what a lot of people spend time on. Here's how I've made this all happen in my classrooms, okay? The difference then is from personal to collaborative is, first of all, there's two kinds of collaborative mapping. And this is something you also need to decide where we want to start and why. An essential map is what I refer to as a collaborative map that's essential in a school, district, or system that has more than one like school. So let me explain that. So if I was in a district and working that had one elementary, one middle, and one high school, we don't have multiples of anything. But if I worked in a district that had 3 elementaries, 1 middle, and 1 high school, I now need essential maps, because it shouldn't matter what school the students are in, there are some essential requirements. So if there's multiple of the same school types in a district or a learning system, then I recommend essential maps is what actually is started with. Consensus maps, again, are this idea of it's within one school or a school system that has one of each school. Now, I have worked in school systems, very large ones, where they have those essential maps. And then those essential maps become the base of the consensus maps per school site. And here's the catch, listen close. What's getting added on at those consensus map levels is more of the H. It's the hows we're going to make this come alive, right? That has a tendency to happen. So when I think about collaborative mapping and I think about my grove, I think about, and this is what I love to do, I love systemic mapping, is I think about a aspen grove. Some of you maybe work in the science world in your educational efforts, and you might know what's unique about an aspen grove is it actually comes, actually comes from one root system. In other words, it's one seed. This is not trees, it's one tree. But the trees are all connected by the root system. So now we collaboratively know what is our shared agreement. What do we agree on that needs to be learned? And we could even to have some agreement on how it must, or we could recommend some ways that it can be taught, assessed, or evaluated. So we want to be thinking about this. So to me, a very important piece, if some of you are already at the point of having a platform, is you want to be thinking about, does our platform that we're using easily tell the readers of our maps? It's an essential map, it's a consensus map, it's an individual map. How do we able to find that? How can we search this system of roots quickly to find that? So Keenan, if you would please, you might have to go back one. Could you go back one and just talk a little bit about this in Chalk? How can you find it quickly?
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Janet. And quickly wanted to show a couple of different examples, really highlighting the fact that at the end of the day, you want to make sure that the decisions you're making match what your school system is geared towards. So in the example we're looking at here, we can see we have all the consensus maps and we have different things we can use, whether it's the naming or the color coding. And so what I want to switch over to is an example over here where typically what you'll see in your curriculum mapping system is you'll have a lot of content, right? And the bigger your system is, if you have a lot of schools, as Jenna was saying, if you have multiple elementary schools, you'll want to be able to come in through here and make sure it's organized and that you can easily find what you're looking for. And one of the ways that Chalk helps with this is allowing for, whether it's the naming convention or using what we call tags, is essentially naming things the way that you want them to and being consistent across the board. So going on that example of consensus maps, for example, we are able to come in here and use that as a tag within the system. Again, keeping in mind, this is flexible to what your school or your district is looking to accomplish. And once you've applied this, it will narrow down what you're looking at based on kind of that criteria you use. So here we can see we have our math, we have science, English language arts, consensus maps for our school. And if we're wanting to hone in even further, we can go beyond that level of that lens, so to speak, and even hone in further. So if we wanted to maybe look at math, we could hone in and we now are seeing all of our consensus math maps for our building. So there's a lot of different ways that you can flexibly structure that, however you see fit. We just wanted to show you an example of how that might apply for your school. And with that, I'll hand it over to you.
Can you go back to that for just a second?
Oh, sure, yeah.
Okay. So the other thing too, everybody, just again, why it's important to have these conversations up front. So first of all, obviously this school system has said, okay, everybody, when we develop math curriculum, we're always going to code it with blue. So do you see on the side there? Like, so if you take out math for just a second at the top, Keenan, from your search, notice all of a sudden all different colors come up again, because this school system has taken the time to say, all right, we want to make sure that our system is easy to flow through its roots and find what we want to find. So what's interesting here is you'll notice, can you go up there and just put science in just for a quick example? Okay. So notice that they've chosen that to possibly be green, right? So we figured that out. But now if you swing back over to mine, just for an example again, yeah. So notice here in this school system, they did it where each one of the grades has a different color. So in this case, if you were to search for grade 1, all of the grade 1 maps would be green. If you search for grade 3, all of them would be blue. And so back to what Sarah said earlier, nothing's right or wrong. You just need to figure out what yours is going to be. Because the more you do this up front and get ready, remember, slow and steady, the better it is going to be able to use your system, whatever that your system is. So that's just a really important piece I want you to be aware of. Okay, so let's go on back to see our little squirrel there, because I want to make one little point. before we have a little bit of a talk time. So do I have, there we go.
Yep,
okay.
should be you
So
now. Yep.
evolution of mapping, everyone. Please listen to this. So as I shared back in 1997, finally 1998 was published, the book by Heidi Hayes Jacobs. We've been doing this now for over 2 decades. And to think anything is going to say exactly how it was, you have not been in education very long. So the evolution of mapping has even happened. And I just want to make sure that you're aware of something. So for example, if you look at one of my books that I wrote, you know, it talks about, do we start with the projected diary map or individual mapping? Do we start with consensus? So in this evolution of mapping, here's what's happening. I'm finding already now in this sort of beginning of the 3rd decade, if you will, of this 21st century. And that is that many schools now, absolutely without a doubt, they're starting with collaborative maps. That's just where they're starting. It could be an essential map, it could be a consensus map, but they're starting with collaborative. And then teachers are not even doing personal maps at all. Instead, teachers are working together on the how. They're those contractors. Boom, here is the blueprint. Now let's really populate all the hows that we can make this come alive in our students' best interest and do collaborative lesson planning and attach those to the actual maps. So that's a change that I see really happening. And then another one, and I just absolutely love this picture, just makes me smile every time I look at it. But you know, life's gotten a little bit nuts. Let's all be honest about that the last few years. So really with this lost learning, et cetera, I'm working with a lot of clients who want to really focus on prioritizing the standards and just figuring out what is the critical learning. That's inging, that's mapping to help students get caught up, if you will, or get that lost learning built back in them. And so again, it's all about the inging. It isn't so much about having a map as a final product by tomorrow. So I just think you need to really have these kinds of conversations. What's happening in your grove? What really is going to be best for what's going to happen first, second, third, and so on. And don't feel obligated that you must do it a certain way or must do it like a district nearby you or a school, because it has to be what's right for you and yours. So with that, I'll just take a moment to step back to see if anybody has a question or a concern after hearing about the types of maps.
We got some great questions already. One from Samantha here who asks, would it make sense to use a consensus map in a school that has more than one classroom for each grade?
That's a great question. So a consensus map would actually represent the learning, the base learning in all of those classrooms. So I actually worked with a school district that had an elementary school with 11 classrooms per grade level. Woo! They worked together collegially on a consensus map. And in that school, they actually did have the teachers, that was a few years ago now, they actually then made a clone or they copied that consensus map and then they personalized it for themselves to kind of show a little bit about pacing, like this idea of it took me a week longer, a week shorter, and then they actually attached their lesson plans to their personalized one versus the consensus. But a consensus means within a school site. So the option would be a consensus map, or each individual teacher would be doing an individual personalized map. Again, my caution though is that they have a tendency to do it more like the contractor versus the architect. So they would need to have some really good training if they were going to be doing it individually so that you wouldn't have that problem crop up.
Another question here. Do you believe that students have the right to know the curriculum from the beginning of the school year and map it to them on a board?
Oh, it's a great question. Kind of got that when I went to college, didn't I? Right? So I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think you have to think about the maturation of the student. I think you have to think, especially with a lot of personalized learning, I think definitely taking this idea of here are our bigger goals, I absolutely embrace it. One of my latest books is on documenting learning and asking the students to actually show that they are learning what they're supposed to be learning. So I don't have any problem with that. I just think that for some students, it could be overwhelming. So I think, again, you have to think about your student, your students. But I have no problem with that. I mean, I also think, shouldn't our parents, our stakeholders know what our curriculum is? The only thing I will tell you this is, good little story, is assessments. I don't think assessment should be public because for obvious reasons. Matter of fact, I've had a couple of districts, I'm sure this happens to none of you out there, they had a problem internally where parents, quote unquote, were teachers. and they had all of the assessments online, obviously in their system. Well, guess what happened? Some of the students of parents who worked in the district did very, very well on the tests. So when you talk about making things public, I think there always has to be conversations about what's the purpose and why is it becoming public? And then I think you have to work out what's best for all the stakeholders at that point. So I'll take one more if you have one, Sarah, and then we'll move on.
Yes. How do you ensure standards for a subject such as life skills, which looks very different for out of school children in third world countries?
Okay, so can you read the first part of or say the first part again?
Sure. How do you ensure standards for a subject such as life skills?
Okay, so I'm actually working with a school in India right now on that very thing. We're developing our competencies, and a lot of them are actually just health. Like, how do we stay healthy? How do we make sure we're brushing our teeth properly? So, also you can also look at health and PE standards. There are some national ones that also address those. So there are standards out there, but also I go back to say what I said at the beginning. You might want to create your own competencies and your own standards that address what it is that you want your students to know and be able to do. So great questions. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I think somebody said in the chat, when I talk about assessments, I'm full believer of, you can say the name of the assessment. What happened though was they put the actual assessment on, and that's what happened with the little oops. It got sort of like taken, and it shouldn't have, right? So, all right. So just kind of rounding the corner here for our last two areas, defining common map elements. So this is one that, again, I take a lot of time up front, really focusing on our mental models. What are our mental models to make sure that we have clarity, building that capacity? Because otherwise, if you start going to a curriculum map that has these different map fields and elements, and your stakeholders don't have agreement on what those mean, you're going to have a problem building your units of study. So what I want us to do is kind of think about that from bringing back now in this idea of teach versus learn. So remember, we talked about learn is all the W's and the teach is the H. So I put pretty typical element fields that you'll find on a unit of study here. And I'd like you to just kind of think for a moment, when you think of a unit of study title, the standards themselves, an essential question, vocabulary. By no means are these all of them that could be on, but these are pretty much the most common ones. If you were to have to put an L or a T, what do you think now the elements within the MAPS unit of study meet with, as far as, if you will, our stool or learning or teaching? So take a second. You can put things in the chat, or you can just chat to yourself, but just take a few moments like, if I had to label these L or T, here's what I would do. So I'll give you a few moments to do that. All right. Okay. So some of them may surprise you, some of them may not, but I wanted to kind of hopefully teach you a little bit about thinking about each one, again, to stop those roadblocks from happening for those of you, especially that are at those beginning stages. But when it comes to the unit title, like the name of the unit, that very much so should be a part of learning, right? Now, I'll give you a good example of where sometimes it gets mixed up. So if I was in writing or working on designing architecturally some English language arts maps, and let's just say I'm up in the high school level, and we actually title our unit Macbeth. Well, think about it. I have just narrowed down pretty heavily what the learning is going to be about. Matter of fact, I've taken technically a resource, which is Macbeth, and I'm using that sort of to say that is what this unit's all about. So imagine if we called the unit Shakespearean Tragedies. That kind of changes, because there is some ELA high school Common Core that does expect you to work on Shakespearean works. But if we say Shakespearean tragedy, for whatever reason, where our school has decided that's what we want to work on, but one teacher can pick Othello, another teacher can pick Hamlet, or as someone just said, what do the students want to read? Right? It doesn't matter what they're reading because it's about the skill expectation. So it isn't about the actual work. It's about the idea of thinking about antagonists and protagonists and the language that's being used. So we really have to be thoughtful even about the title of the unit. And again, if teachers aren't trained in this, they have a tendency to name their units from the contractor side, not from the architect side. And I'm sure, no surprise, the standards is kind of, if you will, where the learning, the phoenix rising is coming from. So that without a doubt is going to be learning. But I will make a little point. I put it up here on purpose at the top because I do sometimes get asked to audit people's curriculum. And a lot of times the standards are listed first. And I always suggest put those at the bottom. And the reason is you're not teaching the standards. The standards are what are, if you will, lending themselves guideline-wise to what that learning is going to be. So I always flip the standards and have them at the bottom because teachers, honestly, they want to get to the skills. That's really their go-to, along with the essential questions of vocabulary. But like standards, if it's really long and gets in the way, it's kind of bothersome. Essential questions, if you're familiar with UBD, very much should be coming from a learning perspective because they have big ideas, transfer knowledge. What is it we want them really to have out of this learning? Vocab is also this idea of learning. I do a lot with systemic vocabulary. As we know, Marzanos and others have said that, if we have good quality understanding of vocabulary, it's going to help our students. Content, by definition, is what do we want our students to know? Know can be concepts, knows can be content, knows can be topics, but what we want them to know, it's very much a part of that learning. Why? Based on the standards or based on what it is that you're focusing on. Skills, by definition, I'm not going to show it to you yet. I've done this for 20 years. Teachers quite often think skills are teach, and they're not. Skills are what the students have to know and be able to do. And teachers quite often get this confused with what they're doing in their lesson plans. And so they end up writing them as a teaching point, not as a learning point. So that one you have to be very careful on. Now, the only one that's both, and it goes back to our stool, is assessments and evaluation. And evaluation, I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get together next time. But really, it's this idea of what is it you want them to know and be able to do, and how are you going to find this out? So it's really a combination of that teach and learn. Resources and materials are going to be teach, and lessons and activities are also going to be teach. But here's a point I want to make, because I don't think we've had it yet, Sarah, possibly in the question, but it always comes up. Should we be mapping if we have a program? It doesn't matter the program. It could be a reading program, can be a math program, it doesn't matter. I always say that's a great question, because what you need to understand is when you buy a program, you're buying the stool. Somebody has already done the architectural work. What you're buying big time is the two legs on instruction and assessment. And you got to remember, whoever wrote the program, they have figured out their own interpretation of the standards, which may or may not be in agreement with what you're doing in your school, specifically because of your population. So someone brought up a third world country. So I have no problem with someone having a program, but whether to map it is a great question to have, and a question I deal with a lot when I do work with school districts. So just be aware of that. So just want to be sure, as we're kind of wrapping up this piece, that when it comes to your map elements, you need to figure out just defining what that is, how it's going to play out, so that when we talk to our teachers, and I know, Keenan, you can address this well, because we're going to see something in a minute. You can even in your mapping system, can you go back one, Keenan? Please?
Yeah, I'll go, I think we're here, right?
Yeah. When you get into your mapping system, you even have the ability to have a little information button that says, hey, this is what this is defined as. So you have to, on a school level, can you pop over to the live side? Yeah. You want to go ahead and be able to say, so like here we have content. So you have a little button. So can you click the little button? Yeah. So there, when you decide what your protocols are and what these are, you can put that in there. So when your teachers or whomever is actually creating your units of study, everybody is going to have the same understanding of what is wanted in there. So again, I just wanted to show you kind of a little bit of a actual unit of study. So if you close that out, Keenan, you'll see if we kind of just scroll down, you've got your essential question, you've got your content, scroll on down. Then you've got sort of your skill sets, your types, and everything that you see kind of here, like blue versus black and some other things. I'll be really addressing that big time in our part 2. But again, you can see when you scroll on down, now you've got your some assessments and evaluations. Scroll on down, you've got your vocabulary. And then, as I said, I like to put the standards at the end. So again, my point is you want to make sure that you've had these conversations up front. What's what, how are we defining it? And then eventually, which I'll talk about more in our part 2, what are your protocols when your teachers become architects and actually write units of study? So with that said, let's go ahead and take just one more little kind of rest, if you will, on our bench and just see if anything I've shared with you right now is kind of popping up in your, I thought I knew, now I know, now I wonder. And then I'll take just a few moments briefly about thinking implementation, and then we'll see, Sarah, if anybody has any Q&As that they'd like to have to wrap up today.
Sounds great. We'll just give people an opportunity to respond to the share and chat prompt. Reminder as well that if you have any questions for Janet at the end of today's session, please use the Q&A feature. Just a quick question. I heard you say that teachers will write units of study. Is that the case?
Yes, I really believe strongly in teachers writing them. I'm going to do a yes and right now. Unfortunately, the last 2 years, because of the COVID situation, you know, everyone knows it's just almost impossible to get substitutes and get teachers to fill in for when our teachers are out for COVID. So I am finding that currently right now in some schools and districts, I'm actually working with more of an administrative staff that has an expertise, and then trying to find 1 or 2 teachers that can actually do that without interrupting their class time as much. But if it was like the perfect world of rainbows and unicorns, pre-COVID, post-COVID, absolutely, because guess who's closest to the students? The teachers. So yes, I always want to have teachers involved in designing the curriculum.
Great.
Anything else pop up?
One person shared their response to this. They say, I thought I knew what a curriculum map was, and now I have no idea, and I wonder what new things the next session will bring.
Well, we'll definitely be focusing on that next session, because that's exactly what we're going to be focusing on now, getting down with those binoculars and looking more at what would be in a map and how you make some decisions around that. So that's great.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's go ahead and just spend a little bit of time, just a quick overview. Remember, we're on the mountaintop, just kind of looking out, determining a curriculum development plan. So what I mean by that is kind of what I said at the beginning. What are you going to start with? Because you cannot do everything. In my books and others, they'll tell you curriculum mapping takes 3 to 5 years to fully implement in multiple disciplines. So please do not think you can do it all in 1 year. Okay. So, oh my goodness. Keenan, what happened here?
Here, let's,
there we go.
We're good. Oh.
Keep going forward a little bit more. I'm gonna let you go forward. There we go. Oh, back one.
Here we go.
Okay. So collaborative mapping. I already said that's really where I recommend you start. And then deciding, do we need an essential map? Do we need a consensus map? Now, and also someone just said, do we have teachers? Do we not? So this kind of shows you the history, if you will, of mapping in a photography kind of way. So on the left-hand side, it's me working with teachers back in the day when it was all teachers and we were working side by side, no masks. In the middle is actually some work I've done the last few years. I'm working with a charter school in North Carolina, and they're really building social justice into their curriculum. So they're actually working on their competencies and kind of figuring out how they're going to interweave that within their kind of humanities courses. You'll notice we're kind of all masked, but we're still all meeting. And then on the right-hand side, I do a lot of work now with teachers and administrators in the world of Zoom, as we are sort of meeting today. So I'm finding it's a little bit of both. Now, I love this picture on the right, and I did get permission to show this, but you'll see she doesn't look too happy at the bottom there, Mandy. Because she gets frustrated because we're having to meet this way. But what's exciting is I'm actually now getting to meet with their teachers again, and they are working on some math curriculum and prioritizing their math standards. So, but again, I think in today's world, we have to think about how we can juggle. I also want to share with you that you notice I have a discipline with an asterisk here, and that is that if you want to start if you're not a school that's already dealing with very strong interdisciplinary units, like if you're an IB school, you're already doing very strong interdisciplinary, but if you're not in that kind of a framework or model, starting with a discipline is the best way to begin. And honestly, math is the one that's quote unquote the easiest to map. And I say that with a quote unquote because it's all not easy. There's lots of decisions that have to be made, but it's a little bit more, and again, no pun intended, it is concrete. So you have to also be thinking about whatever discipline you pick or whichever way you want to begin, you have to think about the role that your standards are going to play. And so I just want to kind of wrap up this piece talking about the fact that we've got a concern with these standards that number one, they are not the curriculum. And so I love this quote by Lynn Erickson, where we take this idea of to design a curriculum, we have to figure out the intent of the standards. And so that takes a lot of inging and working with the teachers to figure that out. So that's one thing. And the second thing is we have to prioritize our standards. I want you to take just a moment, and some of you might know this answer, but there is research done back in the early 2000s. Marzano did a study, and there was a few others that looked at taking all of the standards and all the different disciplines that a student has kind of in their backpack. How many years does it actually take if every single component of kind of broken apart standard, everything that's in there, how many years do they have to be in school to actually master all of them? So just take a second. What do you think? And just pop into the chat, just real quick. How many years do you think it was? And it was not only proved in Marzano's study, but it was also found true in other studies. So someone says 21, 30.
30, 21, 22, 30-ish, more than 12.
More than 12. Okay. More than 13 if you have a kindergarten, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. So the correct answer, drum roll please, is 23 years. So even before we had COVID and lost learning, we would all still need to be talking about, and I do this a lot, with the reality that we have to leave things out. So, and you're hearing a lot of people talk about this even today. What do we keep that we're saying is absolutely essential learning? What are we going to cut, and what degree are we going to cut it to? So there's lots of dialogue I can have about this, and I really can't today, but we need to have some conversations about, if we're talking about building curriculum around standards, even if we start with math, we have to think about that. So just a very quick milestone journey I'll show you, and I'll talk about this more in part 2, but I was with one district. This is just an example of one district. We formed a math task force of teachers, grade K through 12, because that's what they were. And I did a standards of literacy training. Just what are standards? How do you read standards? Because that's something else that teachers do not have actually a training on. And a lot of administrators don't as well, believe it or not. So I do a big piece on standards literacy. Then we work on, I go through breaking apart all the standards, and they prioritize them: critical, need to know, or still need to know, this idea that we might be able to cut it. Once they went through that process, and that didn't happen in a day, we figured out what was our essential learning, because this was a collaborative district. So we were actually working on this essential map idea. We then worked with K-5, then with 6-8, then with high school, and we figured out our content listings. This idea of what is it we want our students to know mathematically across those grade levels from a content point of view. After we did that, then I started meeting a little bit more by grade level chunks. We did that whole piece first systemically. Then I worked with K1, then with 2-3, then with 4-5. In other words, we built upon it to do skills and vocabulary across the grade levels. And then after that, we systemically aligned, made sure everything flowed well. We had it exactly how we wanted it across those grade levels. Then we went ahead and worked on, we did some assessment training with them because a lot of the teachers really didn't have some comfort level with that. And so what were those essential learning assessments that we wanted them to be doing? And then from that, we went ahead and started thinking about the instructional decision-making, which looked very different, like a K2 versus a high school. And then as we do in mapping, mapping's never done. They went through their reflection and revision cycles and iterated a little bit. Like I'm meeting with a school next month. It's been about a year now that they've been working with their curriculum, and they were having a meeting with me to kind of talk about some of the revisions. So again, it doesn't happen overnight. And so it's this idea of planning it out well. So again, also, where are we going to start is another big conversation. A standards-based map. Are we going to do integrated maps? Are we going to do a single discipline? We're going to try interdisciplinary. Are we going to do curriculum maps with aligned lesson plans? Or like I told you all, I'm spending a lot of time right now just doing prioritizing the standards and doing aligned lesson plans with it, like, because that's where the teachers are and where they are with their students. So the idea is just kind of look ahead. Where are you going on those long and short-term goals? So that's an overview of our mountaintop experience of what we should be thinking about and doing before we get started. Again, it's all about building that capacity, really about getting our thoughts wrapped around what are our mental models, no longer, but our collegial and collective models of terminology, what things are going to look like, and the procedures we're going to take. So to kind of wrap up our mountain experience, we're kind of just going to check out your compass, where it is, getting ready for part 2 next time. So NSEW, in just a moment, we're going to want you to, again, fill up the chat kind of in conclusion for where you are for your N. What do you need further explanation about? I could wrap that into our next time. What was a significant aha you had? What are you excited about? Maybe there's something you're worried about. You have to do all of them. You don't have to do them in any order, but we're just going to get a feeling of kind of where you are to wrap up today. So Sarah, of course, just take a look at those when they pop on in and just share some that you read.
Of course. Just give everyone a moment to sort of process their thoughts and everything that they've learned over the past hour. Certainly a full session there. Someone says, need further explanation on the most effective way to write the map. And I mean,
that's part 2.
Definitely part 2.
Yep.
So make sure you join us for that. Now they're really coming in.
I know someone popped in exemplars, and that is something that when I work with school districts, I actually use that. And so just so that person knows, I have exemplars when we meet next time. And so we're gonna really kind of exemplars of what it should look like and what it shouldn't look like, if that makes any sense, and then figuring out what's right for you and your school district.
Someone says they're interested to see how this all integrates with standards-based grading.
Oh, yep, great question. And someone said about DOK. So there's lots of ways that you can integrate your DOK into your skill sets. And so again, as everybody I'm sure knows, I'm doing this on a very, very kind of mountaintop. I always have to think about my individual system that I'm working with in their school, like what's their models, and all of that has to be talked about and taken into consideration. So DOK is something that you can definitely interweave into your skill sets.
We have a aha/excited moment here. Aha meaning that they're maybe not too far behind on their mapping process than I guess they originally thought. And then the excited that they are taking things slow and steady. And I guess this provided the reinforcement that yes, you are doing the right thing, full speed ahead, but slow and steady speed ahead.
It's always great when someone has an affirmation. So how about just 1 or 2 more, and then we'll just see if anybody has any questions, and then we'll wrap it up.
Absolutely. Someone says further explanation, difference between standards and curriculum.
Okay, so and that's a good one. When we meet next week, I will talk about, or next part 2, I will talk about that, because how does that fit in? Because to me, it's the floor, right? It's that floor of the stool, but how it fits in, I will talk about that.
One person says that they are worried that their district seems to start at grade 12 and then work their way down to K instead.
Yeah, and that does happen. And so my suggestion is it's the other way around. But with that said, we do things in such a way that the voice is heard from K through 12 before we go. So remember that journey I showed you was we worked together with grade K through 12. So we got the basics figured out. before we actually built the curriculum maps, and then it was done the lower grades on up. There can be some high school courses that you can do without that, but it's kind of a unique situation. So great questions. All right,
Great.
so any other Q&A in general, Sarah, that you
Oh,
have?
absolutely.
Okay.
The questions have been pouring in.
Okay.
Who should we start off with? So this goes back to what we were talking about a bit earlier. So lesson plans per teacher, per subject, per grade should be collaborative to include special ed versus individual lesson plans. They're looking for clarification on that.
Okay, so I can think of that a couple different ways, because again, it depends. As I said, I always have special ed involved in any type of mapping environment, including lesson plans. So you can actually do that to where you have collaborative lesson plans, and then within the lesson plan, you have differentiation. And that differentiation, we're not necessarily talking about like an Uber IEP. I have a special ed background too. So an IEP student might have a very unique situation, but sort of what is our general like tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 intervention? That differentiation can be built into those lesson plans by the special ed teachers along with the gen ed teachers. They can be done in a collaborative way. So there's not a right or a wrong way. I work in some schools where the teachers are somewhat islanders, right? They're in their own little worlds. And so to get them to even begin, we have them write individual plans, but then we bring those plans together to find some ways, if you will, to create bridges to the islands. And then we start kind of moving toward a collaborative. So I think it varies. But again, a lot of people I work with, their lesson plans do have a portion for differentiation.
Sounds great. Someone says, excellent clarification regarding schools that adopt a program and whether or not they should be mapped with a consensus map. And she says, I am curious about what your thoughts are on the Lucy Calkins units of studies and chalk.
Okay. Well, Lucy Calkins, I got one right around the corner. I have a lot of people that use Lucy Calkins. And I work with actually an international school in Vietnam that's using the Lucy Calkins. And if you work in any international schools, I think you all know that there's kind of a revolving door, like teachers kind of come and go every couple of years. So they did make a conscientious effort to truly map the Lucy Calkins units. Their biggest problem is that they're working with a population of second language learners, and Lucy Calkins, it's great stuff, but you have to think about, again, that differentiation for a second language learner. So there's that piece into it. So we've had to figure out a way to kind of figure that out. But you can map. I mean, the one thing I just recommend is this. Don't just map a program to map it, because then the next time you get a program, the teachers are going to get frustrated because they got to map that all over again. So that's what you want to stay away from. So there's other ways that you can build around that. So I'm not saying that just because you have a program, you should not be mapping and doing map work. It's just that it will depend on what it looks like and how it does for that meaning. As far as chalk goes, as you all well know, I'm here. And so chalk is an absolute perfect platform for both mapping, so the maps themselves, and also for lesson planning. And I know, Keenan, next time you're going to talk about how to even show them put together. So they're,
using your awesome exemplars.
Yeah. So one thing I will say is this. So please, everybody, listen to this. There's nothing wrong with starting with Google Docs, because that's a question I always get too. Nothing wrong with that whatsoever in the beginning. There'll be a point, though, where Google Docs cannot do what a platform can do. It can't do searches. It can't do some things I'll even show you next time with side-by-sides. So at some point in your mapping journey, you're going to want to get on the bus and take a little ride with some kind of a system, because it's just going to make the ride and the journey that much easier. Otherwise, it's going to be very kind of tiresome. You only can like hike so long, right? So that would be my way of thinking about that. All right. Do you have any more questions, Sarah?
Oh, we do.
Okay.
So someone says they love the demonstration in chalk there about having the standards at the bottom as opposed to the top. They said that it's super clever because most teachers never make it past the first page. So they're asking you, if you're putting the standards at the bottom, what do you then put at its place at the top? She's wondering if essential questions are maybe ideal there because it's the viewpoint of the kids first, or if there's another element that you would prioritize.
Great question. So, and again, what's great about chalk is that you can put those standards anywhere you want. So when I built my template that I wanted to use, that's where I put it. So then in response to that, you can put anything you want at the top. So it is that idea of what do we want the teachers to most focus on. Now I'll give you an example of essential questions. I think essential questions are great, but a lot of times they're not used actually in the classroom beyond putting them up on a wall and saying, yep, got it up there. Well, then do I really want that to be the first thing on my map? I don't know. Do you know what I mean? In other words, I think what needs to be up there needs to be what is most important for the teachers, if you will. So I think that that's a great conversation that the system has to have and decide. Now, I have worked in some systems, and I know, I'm pretty sure, Keenan, you can answer this. Depending on the discipline, they've had a slightly different map unit. So for example, with next generation science standards, those are some of the most unique, totally cool standards I've ever seen. I have some school districts that their unit template for science now does not look quite the same as the others, but the way they tag it, Keenan talked to that about it already, the way they tag it, when things are pulled up, some of those same kind of things are pulled together, even though it might be called something different in one template versus another. So that's again where that tagging comes in handy.
For sure. We have two questions that are sort of the similar line of thought. How can you manage the work for all content areas at the same time? And then how are you creating the time for teachers to help write these units of study in a mapping format? So it's kind of that time management aspect.
Right, exactly. So, and I'll talk about that, and I'm not trying to push it off to next week, but I do talk about that a little bit in the next part too. But again, you cannot do all the disciplines at one time. You cannot. So what you need to do is you need to figure out, based on your data or based on just what's going on in your world, what do we want to start with first? And like, so for example, I still remember this. I worked with a school district where I'll talk about a curriculum mapping cadre or cabinet, which is a mixture of administrators and teachers. And so they were trying to, they narrowed it down to English or math was what they were going to start with as a full systemic, like K-12 environment. I still remember the person, the CIA director, the person in charge of curriculum instruction assessment, the way that she wanted to do it was she had the teachers think about what they really wanted to go for. And this is like the world language teacher was involved, the PE teacher, like everybody on this cadre were not the ELA or math teachers, but they as a district, if you will, were deciding. These were the core leadership that were making decisions about what happened first, second, third, fourth. Anyway, what I remember was they all had to go to one side of the room if they were ELA or the other side of the room if they were math. And so they went across and she was all about ready to count. And this one gal, like she just all of a sudden she started moving and whoop, she went across. She was the deciding factor. It ended up being math or it would have been ELA. So, but my point is that was the big discipline, right? So that was that one K through 12. Well, in their district, they also have world languages that are offered in high school and an exploratory in middle school. We were able to also start with them because it's a much smaller group. It's like one department, right? So we kind of picked one big and one small to begin with. And then we built out a plan for the next few years. Then again, to ask about the teachers, there's different ways of doing it. I can tell you this though, I'll give you some advice. Do not try to get teachers to write unit plans an hour or two after school or before school. It doesn't work very well. They're tired, it's hard to get in, and then they don't do it again for a month. So you really do have to start figuring out that planning. And a lot of districts I work with, they get board approved more days in the year, or some start doing summer work, but there's different ways to do it. So, and then it's only getting a little bit harder now, really, because of the COVID situation, and trying to find substitutes are getting very, very difficult. But what I found is that what I do love about working with a small group of people per grade level, because that's another suggestion I'll say is if you have, like, remember I said there was 11 teachers that taught at one grade level in this one school, having all 11 of them try to come together and create the curriculum for that grade is just too many bodies. So what they did for that school is, knowing the big four, ELA, math, social studies, and science, those 11 teachers had to decide which one they wanted to go to. So the point is, they all were working on one discipline over time, but they all knew how it was done because they all had to do it with a discipline. So it was when somebody developed the social studies, if I was developing math, I'm totally cool with what they developed in social studies, because I know they have to be totally cool with what I developed in math. So it was sort of a way they were able to figure out that and again, they still kind of worked on one at a time, but every teacher was involved in a particular one. Another typical situation is a smaller school. So K1, 2, 3, 4, 5. K1, only one teacher. So one teacher K, one teacher 1. The two of them developed the kindergarten curriculum, and the two of them developed the first grade. In other words, don't have one person ever develop a collaborative map. It doesn't even go with the word, right? So that's another piece to think about. So all those kinds of things have to be thought about. So just for the sake of time, how about one more question, Sarah? And then I'm sure some of these kind of things will definitely can carry over, and we'll have conversations in our part 2.
Absolutely. So last question, how can I support teachers next year when we start working on mapping at the district? What will they need to have the vertical discussions?
Attend part 2. I'm serious though. I figured these kind of questions would be coming up. So I will talk about that and very much about where you want to start. Again, I'm much more of a proactive than a reactive. And so I think you'll like seeing what I do on a proactive level, that when it comes time to actually start mapping and making the maps, it becomes so much easier because you've already figured out the big stuff kind of vertically, if you will, or even horizontally if you need to, before you ever make the noun. And that to me is a real critical piece. Okay.
Sounds great. I think that's.
Oh my gosh, it's been so much fun. I could talk like another hour right now. So I will let you take back over, Sarah, and thank you so much to you and Keenan for all you did to make today happen.
Awesome.
Absolutely.
Oh, I should probably say this.
Oh yeah.
Before I turn it over to you, but I like this saying, good company in a journey makes the way seem shorter. So people have already asked like how. I think I'm good company. Maybe. I don't know. But if anybody does want to reach out to me personally, I have my information right here, and you're more than welcome to do so. And I'd love to talk to you about what's happening in your worlds. And definitely join us for part 2 next time around. All right. So now, Sarah, let's take over.
Absolutely. So on behalf of Chalk, thank you all for joining us today. We hope you really enjoyed this session with Janet Hale, obviously a great expert. And we're continuing this conversation next week with part 2, where we really dive into the implementation side of curriculum mapping. So that is Thursday, February 17th at 3 p.m. Eastern or 12 p.m. Pacific. And you can learn more about Chalk and our services, how we can help you with your curriculum initiatives by visiting us at chalk.com/demo. Thank you everyone so much for joining us today. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.